Sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones sitting around your own dinner table. Sometimes betrayal doesn't announce itself with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it's as simple as 12 empty chairs and the sound of laughter echoing from another room while you stand alone in your kitchen, staring at the feast you spent 3 days preparing. I thought I knew my family. I thought blood meant loyalty. I thought decades of sacrifice meant something. But when you're 52 years old and you discover that the people you've given your entire life to see you as nothing more than unpaid help, well, that's when you realize it's time to serve up something they never saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Catherine Williams, though most people in Cedar Falls, Colorado, just call me Cat. I've lived in this mountain town for 28 years, ever since I married my college sweetheart Marcus, and followed him here when he took over his father's construction business. Our house sits on Pine Ridge Drive, a sprawling ranch-style home with timber beams and floor-to-ceiling windows that showcase the Rocky Mountain views. Marcus always said we built it big enough for the family we planned to have and the gatherings we'd host. He was right about the gatherings, wrong about almost everything else. We have 3 children together. Sarah, 26, who moved to Denver after college and works for some tech startup that apparently makes her too important to visit more than twice a year. Michael, 24, who's been living in our basement for the past 3 years while he figures things out and plays video games 16 hours a day. And Jessica, 22, who just graduated from Colorado State and acts like she invented independence. Then there's Marcus, 54 years old, with the same charming smile that won me over in college, but hands that have grown softer over the years as his business has grown more successful, and he's delegated the actual construction work to his crews. Marcus and I have been married for 28 years, though for the last 5, it's felt more like a business partnership than a marriage. We function well together, host beautiful dinner parties, maintain our standing in the community, and present the perfect picture of a successful couple. What the outside world doesn't see is how I've gradually become the manager of everyone else's life, while my own dreams collected dust in the corners of our oversized house. I used to be a graphic designer before the children came along. I had my own small studio downtown, creating logos and marketing materials for local businesses. I was good at it, really good. I won several regional awards and had clients from as far away as Denver seeking out my work. But when Sarah was born, Marcus and I decided it would be better if I stayed home. Then Michael came along, then Jessica, and somehow 22 years passed without me ever returning to work. The studio space downtown is now a yoga boutique, and my design software sits unused on an old laptop in the spare bedroom. Marcus's construction business, Williams & Sons, has grown into one of the most successful companies in the county. We build custom homes for wealthy transplants from California and Texas who want their mountain retreats. The irony isn't lost on me that it's called Williams & Sons, when Michael has shown zero interest in construction and more interest in energy drinks and online gaming tournaments. Marcus keeps talking about legacy and family business, but he's built a company that our son wants nothing to do with and named it after a tradition that may die with him. The house is my domain, my responsibility, my full-time job without pay or recognition. I manage the schedules, coordinate the repairs, handle the finances, organize the social calendar, and maintain the relationships with our extended families. I remember birthdays, anniversary dates, graduation ceremonies, and every important milestone for not just our immediate family, but for Marcus's parents, his 2 brothers and their families, and my own scattered relatives. I send the Christmas cards, buy the gifts, plan the vacations, and somehow manage to make it all look effortless. Our extended family is extensive and complicated. Marcus's parents, Robert and Helen Williams, are both 71 and still live in the original family home downtown. Robert founded the construction business 50 years ago, and Helen has spent 5 decades perfecting the art of passive-aggressive commentary disguised as helpful suggestions. They expect to be included in every major decision and most minor ones, despite officially retiring and turning the business over to Marcus 8 years ago. They have opinions about everything, from how I cook the turkey to why I don't attend their Methodist church regularly enough. Marcus's older brother David lives in Colorado Springs with his wife Janet and their twin daughters Emma and Olivia, who are both 19 and attending Colorado College. David runs a successful accounting firm and never misses an opportunity to point out how well his daughters are doing in school compared to our Michael, who dropped out of community college after 1 semester. Janet is one of those women who somehow manages to look perfectly put together at every family gathering, while making subtle comments about how exhausted I look or how much work it must be to maintain such a large house. Marcus's younger brother, Thomas, is the family rebel. He's 49, never married, and spends most of his time traveling the world as a freelance photographer. He shows up to family events with stories of exotic locations and beautiful women, and everyone treats him like he's living some romantic adventure instead of recognizing that he's a middle-aged man who refuses to commit to anything or anyone. He stays in our guest room when he's in town, which happens about 4 times a year, and each visit feels like hosting a teenager who never learned to clean up after himself. My own family is smaller and more complicated. My parents divorced when I was in high school, and my father remarried a woman named Beverly, who's only 8 years older than I am. Dad and Beverly live in Phoenix now, and they visit Colorado once a year, usually in the summer when they can escape the Arizona heat. My mother, Patricia, lives alone in Fort Collins in a small apartment that she's somehow managed to fill with more cats than should be legal. She's 74, fiercely independent, and has never quite forgiven me for moving so far away or for marrying someone she considers beneath my intellectual capabilities. I have one sibling, my younger brother, James, who's 48 and lives in Seattle with his husband, Daniel. James is a successful architect, and Daniel is a pediatric surgeon, and they live the kind of sophisticated urban life that makes our mountain existence seem provincial by comparison. They visit even less frequently than my father, usually just for major holidays, and when they do come, I can see them mentally cataloging all the ways our lifestyle doesn't measure up to their standards. This complicated web of family relationships all converges on our house for major holidays, with me as the central coordinator, chef, host, and general manager of everyone's needs and expectations. Thanksgiving has become the annual marathon event where I spend a week preparing for a single day that leaves me exhausted for a week afterward. But it's also become the measure of my worth in this family, the annual proof that I can still manage to bring everyone together and create the perfect holiday experience. This year felt different from the moment I started planning. Maybe it was because Michael had been particularly difficult lately, refusing to look for work and becoming increasingly hostile when anyone suggested he needed to contribute to the household. Maybe it was because Sarah had been making noises about bringing her new boyfriend, someone none of us had met, and expecting us to just accommodate another person at the last minute. Maybe it was because Marcus had been spending more and more time at work and less time acknowledging that maintaining our household was actually work too. The breaking point came 3 weeks before Thanksgiving when I was reviewing our budget and discovered that Marcus had spent $12,000 on a new fishing boat without mentioning it to me. $12,000. While I'd been clipping coupons and shopping sales to keep our grocery budget manageable, he decided he needed a boat for the fishing trips he takes twice a year with his college friends. When I confronted him about it, he shrugged and said the business was doing well, we could afford it, and he didn't need permission to spend money he'd earned. That word, earned, hit me like a physical blow. as if the 28 years I'd spent managing his household, raising his children, and supporting his career hadn't earned me the right to be consulted on major purchases. As if my contributions were so minimal that they didn't warrant consideration when making financial decisions that affected our entire family. I didn't argue with him that night.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I went to bed early, lay awake staring at the ceiling, and started planning Thanksgiving dinner with a new perspective. If I was just the hired help, if my decades of sacrifice meant nothing, if I was invisible in my own home, then maybe it was time to change that dynamic. Maybe it was time to show my family exactly what they'd taken for granted for so many years. The guest list for Thanksgiving had grown to 12 people, as it always did. Marcus and me, our 3 children, his parents, his 2 brothers and their families, and this year Sarah's mysterious boyfriend who would be joining us. 12 people expecting a perfect holiday meal, complete with all their favorite dishes, served at exactly the right temperature, with the house decorated beautifully and everything coordinated seamlessly. I spent the 3 days before Thanksgiving in intensive preparation mode. I cleaned the entire house from top to bottom, moving furniture to vacuum underneath, washing windows, polishing silver, and arranging fall decorations that I'd been collecting for years. I'd ordered the turkey from the specialty butcher shop in town, the 22-pound organic, free-range bird that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week. I made the cranberry sauce from scratch, using a recipe that required fresh cranberries, orange zest, and a specific type of honey that I had to drive 45 minutes to find. The sweet potato casserole required 3 different kinds of sweet potatoes, roasted separately and combined with heavy cream, real butter, and a pecan topping that I made by candying the pecans myself. The stuffing was made with day-old artisan bread that I bought from the bakery in town, mixed with celery, onions, sage, thyme, and homemade chicken stock that I'd simmered for 6 hours. The green bean casserole wasn't the simple version with canned soup and fried onions. It was made with fresh beans, mushrooms, and a cream sauce that required constant stirring to prevent lumps. I made 3 different types of potatoes because different family members had different preferences. Mashed potatoes with butter and cream for Marcus and his father. Roasted red potatoes with herbs for Helen and Janet, sweet potato fries for the younger generation who'd decided regular potatoes weren't trendy enough. I made homemade dinner rolls from a recipe that required the dough to rise 3 separate times. I prepared 2 different gravies, one with sausage for the meat eaters and one vegetarian version for Daniel, who'd become increasingly particular about his dietary restrictions. For desserts, I made Helen's traditional pumpkin pie using the recipe she'd given me 28 years ago, but somehow never thought I executed quite as well as she did. I made a pecan pie for Robert, who'd mentioned loving it exactly once, 15 years ago, but somehow expected it to appear at every holiday gathering since then. I made a chocolate bourbon cake for Thomas, who'd brought a bottle of expensive bourbon from Kentucky and suggested it would pair well with chocolate. And I made apple crisp for the children, though they were all adults now and most of them were too concerned about their figures to eat dessert anyway. The menu planning alone took hours, coordinating dietary restrictions, personal preferences, and family traditions that had somehow become my sole responsibility to maintain. I made detailed shopping lists organized by store and by day to ensure I could purchase everything at peak freshness. I created a cooking timeline that accounted for oven space, preparation time, and the precise moment each dish needed to be started to ensure everything would be ready simultaneously. Wednesday night, I stayed up until 2 in the morning doing final preparations. I set the table with our good china, the wedding set we'd received 28 years ago and used only for special occasions. I arranged the centerpiece with fall flowers and candles, creating the warm, welcoming atmosphere that everyone had come to expect. I polished the silverware, pressed the cloth napkins, and arranged place cards in calligraphy that took me an hour to complete. I prepared as much food as possible in advance, roasting vegetables, making pie crusts, and preparing side dishes that could be reheated. I organized the kitchen like a restaurant, with ingredients measured and arranged, cooking, utensils laid out in order of use, and a detailed schedule posted on the refrigerator. I even set out serving dishes and labeled them with small cards, indicating which food would go in each one. Thursday morning, I was up at 5:30 to start the turkey. The house was still dark and quiet, with everyone else sleeping soundly, while I began the marathon cooking session that would consume my entire day. I prepared the turkey with a herb butter rub that required mixing fresh herbs with softened butter, then carefully loosening the skin and massaging the mixture underneath. I filled the cavity with aromatics, lemons, onions, and herbs that would flavor the meat from the inside. The turkey went into the oven at 6:15, and from that moment on, my day became a carefully choreographed dance of preparation, cooking, and timing. I moved through the kitchen like a professional chef, starting dishes at precisely calculated intervals, monitoring temperatures, adjusting seasonings, and managing multiple cooking processes simultaneously. By 10 in the morning, the house was filled with the incredible smells of holiday cooking. The turkey was browning beautifully, the cranberry sauce was simmering on the stove, and I was working on the side dishes that would accompany our feast. I'd been cooking for 4 hours straight, and I wouldn't stop until everything was perfect. Marcus wandered into the kitchen around 10:30, dressed in his comfortable clothes for watching football, and grabbed a cup of coffee without acknowledging the extensive food preparation happening around him. He kissed my cheek absently and asked what time dinner would be ready, as if he hadn't been informed multiple times that we'd planned for 3 o'clock to accommodate everyone's travel schedules. The first family members started arriving around 11. Marcus's parents came early, as they always did, with Helen immediately beginning her inspection of my preparations and offering suggestions for improvements. She looked at the turkey and mentioned that she'd always found brining produced more tender meat. She tasted the cranberry sauce and suggested it could use more orange zest. She examined the place settings and rearranged 2 of the forks because they weren't positioned exactly as she would have done it. Robert settled into his favorite chair in the living room and turned on the football game, immediately claiming control of the television and the conversation. Within minutes, he was explaining to Marcus how the business could be improved, despite having been retired for 8 years and being increasingly out of touch with current construction trends and regulations. David and Janet arrived with their twins around noon, and Janet immediately began comparing notes with Helen about my food preparation, while the twins disappeared upstairs to find Michael and complain about having to attend a family gathering instead of spending the day with their college friends. David joined Robert and Marcus in the living room, and soon all 3 men were engaged in loud discussions about football statistics and business strategies. Thomas showed up around 12:30 with his usual dramatic flair, bursting through the front door with stories about his latest photography expedition and gifts from whatever exotic location he'd most recently visited. He handed me a bottle of wine from some vineyard I'd never heard of, and immediately launched into a detailed description of the harvest process and the specific soil conditions that made this particular vintage special. My father and Beverly arrived just after 1, having driven up from Phoenix the day before and stayed in a hotel downtown. Beverly was wearing an outfit that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in 6 months, and she immediately began photographing everything with her expensive camera, as if our family gathering was a tourist attraction she needed to document for social media. James and Daniel flew in from Seattle that morning, and they arrived looking perfectly coordinated in their designer casual wear, carrying expensive wine and a dessert from some trendy bakery that they'd somehow managed to transport across 3 states. Daniel immediately began explaining the challenges of traveling with artisanal chocolate torte, as if we should all be impressed by his dedication to bringing the perfect contribution to our meal. My mother was the last to arrive, driving up from Fort Collins with her car full of cat hair and opinions about everyone's life choices. She hugged me tightly and whispered that I looked tired, then proceeded to offer advice about menu planning that contradicted everything I'd already prepared. She brought a green bean casserole made from a recipe she'd clipped from a magazine, despite knowing I'd already prepared my own version. Sarah arrived just after 2 with her mysterious boyfriend, who turned out to be a perfectly pleasant young man named Kevin, who worked in marketing and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know our family. Sarah had been building up his introduction like it was going to be some dramatic revelation, but Kevin was polite, well-dressed, and eager to help with anything that needed to be done. He immediately offered to assist in the kitchen, which was more help than I'd received from any other family member all day. By 2:30, the house was full of conversation, laughter, and the expectation that dinner would be served at precisely 3 o'clock. I was making final preparations in the kitchen, checking temperatures, warming serving dishes, and coordinating the timing of everything that needed to happen in the next 30 minutes. The turkey had been resting for the appropriate amount of time and was ready to be carved. The side dishes were all finished and warming in the oven. The gravy was perfect, the rolls were golden brown, and everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. At 2:45, I called out that dinner would be ready in 15 minutes and asked everyone to begin gathering in the dining room. I started carrying serving dishes to the table, each one representing hours of preparation and attention to detail. The cranberry sauce went into the crystal bowl that had belonged to my grandmother. The stuffing went into the ceramic casserole, dish that I'd bought specifically for holiday entertaining. The sweet potato casserole went into the copper serving dish that Marcus had given me for Christmas several years ago. I arranged everything on the table with the care of someone setting up a magazine photo shoot. Each dish had its designated place, coordinated with serving utensils and small cards identifying any ingredients that might cause allergic reactions. The turkey, golden brown and perfectly cooked, sat at the center of the table like the crown, jewel of the feast I'd created. At exactly 3 o'clock, I called everyone to dinner. 12 people filed into the dining room, admiring the beautiful table setting and the incredible spread of food I'd prepared. They took their assigned seats, unfolded their cloth napkins, and waited for me to join them so we could begin our traditional Thanksgiving blessing. But instead of taking my seat at the table, I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and dining room, removed my apron, and made an announcement that would change everything. "Please, everyone, start eating. Don't wait for me, I'll be right back." And then I walked out of the dining room, through the kitchen, out the back door, and into my car. I drove away from my house, leaving 12 people sitting at the perfect table I'd created, surrounded by the feast I'd spent days preparing, without any explanation of where I was going or when I'd be back. I drove through town, past the coffee shop, where I used to meet friends before I became too busy managing everyone else's lives to maintain my own friendships. I drove past the art gallery, where I'd once displayed my design work in a group show that Marcus had been too busy to attend. I drove past the lake, where I used to go hiking before family obligations consumed every free moment of my time. I drove for 2 hours through mountain roads and small towns, listening to music I'd forgotten I loved and thinking about the woman I used to be before I became defined entirely by my role as wife, mother, and family coordinator. When I finally turned around and headed home, I felt calmer than I had in years, and I was ready to discover what my family had done in my absence. The house was quiet when I returned at 6 o'clock. The cars were all still in the driveway, but the lights were dim, and I could hear the television playing in the living room. I walked through the front door and immediately noticed that the dining room was empty. The beautiful table I'd set was cleared, but not cleaned. Dirty dishes were stacked haphazardly on the kitchen counter. Serving dishes were left with food, congealing in them, and it was clear that everyone had eaten and then abandoned any responsibility for cleanup. I found them all in the living room, watching football and digesting the meal I'd prepared. They looked up when I entered, and Marcus asked casually where I'd been, as if I'd stepped out to check the mail instead of disappearing for 3 hours. On Thanksgiving Day, I went for a drive, I said simply. Did everyone enjoy dinner? The response was a chorus of compliments about how delicious everything had been, how perfectly cooked the turkey was, how much they'd enjoyed the meal. Helen mentioned that the cranberry sauce could have used more orange zest, but overall everything had been wonderful. Robert said it was the best Thanksgiving dinner he'd had in years. Thomas raved about how the bourbon cake had paired perfectly with the bottle he'd brought. Not one person asked why I'd left during dinner. Not one person acknowledged that it was strange for the host to disappear during the meal she'd spent days preparing. Not one person seemed to think my absence was worth discussing or explaining. They'd simply eaten the food I'd made, enjoyed the feast I'd created, and moved on with their evening as if my presence or absence was irrelevant to their enjoyment. That's when I realized that my family saw me exactly as I'd begun to suspect. I wasn't a person with my own needs, desires, or feelings. I was a service provider, someone who existed to make their lives more comfortable and their gatherings more enjoyable. My worth was measured entirely by my ability to create perfect experiences for them. And as long as the food was good and the house was beautiful, it didn't matter whether I was actually present to enjoy what I'd created. I excused myself and went upstairs to my bedroom, where I sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed myself to feel the full impact of what had just happened. I'd spent 3 days preparing for this gathering, invested hundreds of dollars in ingredients and supplies, coordinated schedules and dietary restrictions, and created a perfect holiday experience for 12 people. And when I'd quietly removed myself from the equation, they'd simply continued without me, as if nothing had changed. That night, after everyone had gone home or retired to their guest rooms, I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of the feast I'd prepared, and began planning something that would ensure this would never happen again. I was done being invisible in my own home. I was done being taken for granted by people who claimed to love me, but treated me like hired help. It was time to serve my family, something they'd never expected and never forget. The truth. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November air that usually made me grateful to live in the mountains. I woke at my normal time, 5:30, but instead of immediately beginning my usual routine of coffee and household management, I lay in bed, listening to the silence. Marcus was still asleep beside me, and the house felt different somehow, as if the previous day had shifted something fundamental in its foundation. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, surveying the aftermath of yesterday's feast. The dishes I'd left unwashed were still stacked on the counter, evidence of a meal that had been consumed without any consideration for the person who'd created it. Normally, I would have cleaned everything the night before, unable to sleep, knowing there was work left undone. But last night, I'd simply gone to bed, leaving the mess as a testament to what had happened. Marcus wandered into the kitchen around 7, dressed for work despite it being the day after Thanksgiving. His construction business never fully stopped, and he had a project deadline that couldn't wait for holiday weekends. He poured himself coffee and glanced at the dirty dishes with mild surprise, as if he'd forgotten they existed. "You didn't clean up last night," he observed, not accusingly, just stating a fact that seemed to puzzle him. "No," I replied simply. I didn't. He waited for an explanation that I didn't provide. After a moment, he shrugged and headed toward the door. I'll probably be late tonight. The Wellington project needs the foundation poured before the weather turns. After he left, I continued sitting at the table, drinking my coffee and thinking about the conversation I'd overheard last night after everyone thought I'd gone to sleep. I'd been in the upstairs hallway when voices from the living room had drifted up through the old heating vents, carrying fragments of discussion that had made everything crystal clear. Helen's voice had been the most distinct, her refined tone carrying easily through the house. She'd been talking to Janet about how strange it was that I'd disappeared during dinner, but not in a concerned way, more like a mild inconvenience that had briefly disrupted the otherwise perfect meal. Catherine's been acting odd lately, Helen had said. Robert and I were just discussing it. She seems stressed about everything, making mountains out of molehills. Perhaps she needs to get out more, find some hobbies. Janet had agreed, suggesting that maybe I was going through some kind of midlife crisis. Empty nest syndrome, probably. Now that the children are grown, she doesn't know what to do with herself. David sees it in his accounting practice all the time. Women who've focused on family suddenly feeling lost when they're not needed as much. The conversation had continued in that vein, a clinical discussion of my mental state by people who saw me regularly but apparently didn't see me at all. They'd attributed my behavior to psychological instability rather than considering that I might have legitimate grievances about how I was treated. They'd diagnosed me with problems instead of examining their own behavior. But it was what Marcus had said that cut deepest. His voice had been quieter, but the heating system carried it perfectly to where I stood listening. Kat's always been high maintenance about the holidays, he'd told his brothers. She puts all this pressure on herself to make everything perfect, then gets upset when people don't appreciate it enough. I keep telling her to simplify, maybe cater next year, but she insists on doing everything from scratch. High maintenance. As if my desire to create meaningful family experiences was some kind of character flaw. As if the work I put into making his family gatherings special was an unreasonable burden I'd chosen to inflict on myself, rather than a gift I'd been giving them for decades. Thomas had laughed and made some comment about how all wives eventually become impossible to please, while David had offered advice about managing difficult women based on his extensive experience with Janet's occasional dissatisfaction with their perfectly organized life. The conversation had eventually moved on to business and sports, but I'd heard enough. My family didn't see yesterday's events as a wake-up call about how they treated me. They saw it as evidence that I was becoming unstable and demanding. They'd pathologized my behavior instead of examining their own. Michael emerged from the basement around 10, looking like he'd slept in his clothes, which he probably had. He glanced at the kitchen mess with the same mild surprise his father had shown, but unlike Marcus, he seemed to consider it someone else's problem to solve. "Is there any leftover turkey?" he asked, opening the refrigerator and beginning to rummage through containers. "Help yourself," I said. "You'll need to wash a plate first." He looked at the dirty dishes as if seeing them for the first time, then grabbed a paper towel and made himself a sandwich using his hands instead of dirtying any additional dishes. This was my 24-year-old son, a grown man who lived in my house rent-free, ate food I purchased and prepared, and couldn't be bothered to wash a single plate. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked around a mouthful of turkey. "You seemed weird yesterday." Weird. Not upset, not hurt, not justified in feeling unappreciated. Weird. "I'm fine, Michael. Just thinking about some changes I want to make." He nodded, absently, already losing interest in the conversation. "Cool. Hey, is it okay if Tyler comes over tonight? We're gonna work on this new gaming setup he got." Tyler was Michael's best friend, another 20-something man who lived with his parents and spent most of his time in virtual worlds. They would commandeer the living room, order pizza on my credit card, and leave energy drink cans and food containers scattered around like territorial markers. Actually, Michael, I think tonight would be a good time for you to start looking for your own place. He stopped chewing and stared at me. What do you mean? I mean, you're 24 years old, and it's time for you to live independently. I'll give you 60 days to find an apartment and a job to pay for it. The sandwich fell from his hands onto the counter. Are you serious? Why? What did I do? It's not about what you did. It's about what you haven't done. You haven't contributed to this household in 3 years. You haven't worked. You haven't helped with maintenance or cleaning. You haven't shown any initiative to build a life for yourself. That's going to change. Michael's face flushed red. This is because of yesterday, isn't it? Because I didn't help with dinner or whatever. Jesus, Mom, you're being so dramatic about everything. Dramatic. The same word Oliver had used in the story I'd heard, the same dismissive tone that reduced legitimate concerns to female hysteria. No, Michael, this is because I've spent 3 years enabling you to avoid responsibility, and I'm done. You have 60 days. He stormed out of the kitchen, muttering about how unreasonable I was being and how he'd never done anything to deserve this treatment. A few minutes later, I heard him on the phone with his father, his voice carrying up from the basement as he complained about my sudden change in behavior. The phone rang around noon. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and I could predict the conversation before I answered. Mum, Dad told me you're kicking Michael out? What's going on? He says you've been acting really strange since yesterday. Strange, weird, dramatic, high maintenance. The vocabulary of dismissal was remarkably consistent across my family members. I'm not kicking him out, Sarah. I'm giving him a reasonable timeline to transition to independent living. He's 24. Most people his age have been supporting themselves for years. But he's having a hard time finding work. The economy is tough, and he doesn't have experience. He's having a hard time finding work because he's not looking for work. He spends 16 hours a day playing video games and sleeping. That's not about the economy. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Mom, are you going through menopause or something? Kevin said you seemed really tense yesterday, and now you're making all these sudden changes. Kevin, the boyfriend she'd brought to exactly one family dinner, was now offering psychological assessments of my mental state. And Sarah was asking about menopause, as if hormonal changes were the only possible explanation for a woman deciding to change her life circumstances. Sarah, I'm going through clarity. For the first time in years, I'm seeing my situation clearly and making decisions based on what's best for me, instead of what's most convenient for everyone else. That sounds selfish, Mom. Selfish. The ultimate accusation leveled at women who dare to prioritize their own needs. I'd spent 28 years prioritizing everyone else's needs, and the moment I suggested prioritizing my own, I was selfish. Maybe it is selfish, Sarah. Maybe it's time for me to be selfish. The conversation ended with Sarah promising to talk to her father about my concerning behavior, as if I were a problem to be managed rather than a person to be understood. Within an hour, Jessica called with a similar message, having been briefed by Sarah about my apparent mental decline. By evening, I'd received calls from Helen, Janet, and even my mother, all expressing concern about my sudden personality changes and offering various forms of help that sounded more like interventions. The family network had activated, diagnosing me with everything from depression to early dementia, all to avoid considering that my behavior might be a rational response to how I'd been treated. Marcus came home after 8, looking tired from his long day at the construction site. He found me in the living room reading a book I'd been trying to finish for 6 months and sat down across from me with the careful posture of someone approaching a potentially volatile situation. "Kat, we need to talk. I've been getting calls all day about yesterday and today. Everyone's worried about you. Worried about me or worried about the changes I'm making?" "Both, I guess. Michael told me you're making him move out. Sarah said you were rude to her on the phone. My mother thinks you might be having some kind of breakdown." I closed my book and looked at my husband, really looked at him. He was still handsome at 54, still carried himself with the confidence that had attracted me in college, but there was something different in his expression now, a wariness that hadn't been there before yesterday. "Marcus, do you know how much money I spent on Thanksgiving dinner?" The question seemed to surprise him. "I don't know. A couple $100. $437, not including the cost of the flowers, candles, and decorations. I spent $437 on ingredients for a meal that 12 people ate in 45 minutes. Okay, what's your point?" "My point is that you spent $12,000 on a fishing boat without consulting me, but you don't know how much I spent creating a holiday experience for your entire family. My point is that your financial decisions are considered normal business choices, while my expenses are apparently invisible." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "The boat was a business expense. I entertained clients on fishing trips." "No, Marcus. The boat was a personal purchase that you justified as a business expense, just like the golf club membership you need for client relationships and the expensive dinners you have to attend for networking. You've convinced yourself that your personal desires are business necessities, while my contributions to our family are just expected free labor. That's not fair, Kat. You know I appreciate everything you do." Do I? When was the last time you thanked me for managing your parents' schedules? When did you last acknowledge that I coordinate all the family gatherings that keep your relationships intact? When have you ever considered that the seamless functioning of our household might require effort and planning? He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know where this is coming from. Yesterday you seemed fine, and today you're talking like I'm some kind of villain." "Yesterday I seemed fine, because I've spent 28 years making sure I seem fine, regardless of how I actually feel. Yesterday I disappeared during the dinner I'd spent days preparing, and not one person at that table thought it was worth discussing. Today I'm done pretending that's normal." Marcus rubbed his forehead, a gesture I recognized as his way of buying time when he didn't know how to respond. "What do you want me to say, Kat? That I'm sorry?" "Fine, I'm sorry. I'm sorry if you feel unappreciated. I'm sorry if I don't notice everything you do. I'm sorry if I bought a boat without asking permission." Permission? As if financial partnership in a marriage was about permission rather than communication. And respect. "I don't want an apology, Marcus. I want change, real change, not just words designed to make this conversation go away." "What kind of change?" I'd been thinking about this question all day, and I had answers ready. I want to go back to work. I want to restart my design business and have my own source of income. I want Michael to move out and learn to support himself. I want us to hire a housekeeper so that maintaining our home isn't exclusively my responsibility. And I want to renegotiate how we make financial decisions. Each item on my list seemed to surprise him more than the last. "Kat, you haven't worked in over 20 years. Starting a business at 52 is risky. More risky than spending the rest of my life financially dependent on someone who makes major purchases without consulting me. The kids don't need you anymore, but that doesn't mean you need to completely change our life. Why can't you find some hobbies, maybe do some volunteer work?" Hobbies, volunteer work, the traditional suggestions for women whose primary purpose has been fulfilled and who are now expected to fill their time with inconsequential activities until they die. Because I don't want hobbies, Marcus. I want a career. I want financial independence. I want to feel like I'm building something for myself, instead of just maintaining what you've built. And if your business fails, if you can't find clients, after being out of the industry for so long, then what? Then I'll try something else. But I won't spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd had the courage to try. We talked for another hour, a conversation that felt more like a negotiation than a discussion between partners. Marcus wasn't opposed to the changes I wanted, but he was skeptical about their feasibility and worried about their impact on our comfortable routine. He agreed to support Michael's transition to independence, though he thought 60 days was too aggressive. He was willing to consider hiring household help, though he questioned whether it was necessary. He would try to be more consultative about financial decisions, though he reminded me that he was the primary earner and therefore bore ultimate responsibility for our economic stability. By the time we went to bed, nothing had been resolved, but everything had been aired. Marcus understood that I was serious about making changes, even if he didn't fully understand why those changes were necessary. He agreed to think about my proposals and discuss them more over the weekend. I lay awake that night thinking about the conversation and about the pattern I was beginning to recognize. Every concern I raised was met with minimization. Every change I wanted was characterized as risky or unnecessary. Every emotion I expressed was interpreted as evidence of instability rather than a natural response to legitimate grievances. Saturday morning brought a surprise visit from Helen and Robert, who arrived unannounced around 9, with obvious intentions of checking on my mental state. They found me in the kitchen, finally dealing with the dishes from Thursday's dinner, and their expressions suggested they'd expected to find me in a more dramatic state of disarray. "Catherine, dear," Helen said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table with the authority of someone who belonged there. "Robert and I wanted to stop by and see how you're doing. We've been concerned since Thursday." Robert nodded gravely. "Marcus mentioned you've been under some stress lately. We thought we might be able to help." I continued washing dishes while they talked, recognizing the intervention for what it was. Helen began by praising Thursday's dinner, emphasizing how much everyone had enjoyed the meal and how beautifully I'd presented everything. She mentioned how proud they were to have such a capable daughter-in-law, someone who knew how to maintain a proper home and create wonderful family experiences. Then came the gentle suggestions. Perhaps I was putting too much pressure on myself to make everything perfect. Maybe I should consider simplifying future gatherings, accepting help from others, or even catering some events to reduce my workload. They understood that managing a household could be overwhelming, especially as one got older and energy levels changed. The subtext was clear. My desire for change was being framed as an inability to cope with responsibilities I'd previously managed successfully. They were offering to help me manage my limitations rather than acknowledging that I might have legitimate reasons for wanting to alter my circumstances. "I appreciate your concern," I said, drying my hands and turning to face them. "But I'm not overwhelmed or struggling to cope. I'm making deliberate choices about how I want to spend my time and energy going forward." Helen's smile tightened slightly. "Of course, dear, we just want to make sure you're thinking clearly about these decisions. Sometimes when we're emotional, we make choices we later regret." Emotional? The catch-all explanation for women's behavior, the suggestion that feelings invalidate reasoning, and that any decision made while experiencing emotion must be suspect. "Helen, I've been thinking about these changes for months. Thursday's dinner just clarified some things for me, but it wasn't an emotional reaction to a single event." Robert leaned forward, adopting the paternalistic tone he used when dispensing business advice. "Catherine, we've been watching you and Marcus build a good life together for almost 30 years. You have a beautiful home, healthy children, financial security. Sometimes the grass looks greener somewhere else, but change for the sake of change can be destructive. I'm not changing for the sake of change, Robert. I'm changing because the current situation isn't working for me anymore. But it has been working, Helen insisted. You've created a wonderful family, maintained a beautiful home, been an asset to Marcus's career. Why would you want to jeopardize all of that to chase some fantasy about being a career woman at your age? Fantasy, career woman. The dismissive language was carefully chosen to make my aspirations sound unrealistic and selfish. Because what you call success, I call limitation. You see a woman who's fulfilled her proper role. I see someone who gave up her own ambitions to support other people's dreams and is now ready to pursue her own. The conversation continued for another 45 minutes, but the positions never shifted. Helen and Robert saw my desire for change as evidence of ingratitude and instability. I saw their resistance as confirmation that they'd never viewed me as anything more than a supporting character in other people's stories. After they left, I called Harriet Morrison, a lawyer I'd known slightly in college, who now practiced family law in Denver. We'd reconnected on social media a few years earlier, and I'd followed her career with the kind of vicarious admiration reserved for women who'd made different choices. Harriet had built a successful practice specializing in divorce and financial planning for women over 40. "Catherine Williams," Harriet said when her assistant connected us. "What a pleasant surprise. How are things in the mountains?" "Complicated," I replied. "I'm hoping you might have time to talk about some changes I'm considering." "Of course. Are we talking about divorce?" The question was direct and practical, exactly what I'd expected from Harriet. "I'm not sure yet, but I want to understand my options before I make any major decisions." We scheduled a consultation for the following Wednesday, and Harriet suggested I bring financial documents and start thinking about what I wanted my life to look like in 5 years. She also recommended I begin documenting my current contributions to the household and family, information that would be valuable regardless of what direction I ultimately chose. Sunday brought another family crisis when Jessica called to announce that she was moving to California to take a job with an environmental consulting firm in San Francisco. The position was exactly what she'd hoped to find after graduation, and she was excited about the opportunity to work on renewable energy projects. But she needed to start immediately, which meant she'd be driving cross-country the following weekend and wouldn't be home for Christmas. Marcus was devastated. Jessica had always been his favorite, the child who shared his practical nature and work ethic. The idea that she was moving across the country to chase idealistic environmental goals struck him as both professionally risky and personally hurtful. "She's throwing away her future," he said after hanging up from a lengthy argument with Jessica about her decision. "Environmental consulting is a niche field with no security. She could get a job with my company tomorrow, learn the construction business, and have a guaranteed career." "Maybe she doesn't want a guaranteed career in construction," I suggested. "Maybe she wants to build something new for herself." Marcus looked at me sharply. "Is this your influence? All this talk about change and following dreams? Did you encourage her to take this job? I didn't even know about it until she called. But yes, I think she should take it. She's 22 years old, and this is exactly the time to pursue the career she wants, instead of settling for the one that's most convenient." Convenient? Building a career with family business isn't convenient. It's smart. It's security and opportunity and legacy. Legacy. The concept that had driven so many of Marcus's decisions, the idea that success was measured by what you passed down to the next generation rather than what you achieved for yourself. "Maybe legacy isn't about forcing your children to continue what you built," I said. "Maybe it's about giving them the confidence to build something of their own." The conversation spiraled into an argument about parenting philosophy, family loyalty, and the proper balance between security and ambition. Marcus accused me of encouraging our children to abandon their responsibilities and chase unrealistic dreams. I countered that I was supporting their right to make their own choices, instead of guilt-tripping them into fulfilling his expectations. By Sunday evening, the house felt like a war zone. Michael was barely speaking to either of us, angry about the ultimatum regarding his living situation and frustrated by his father's failure to override my decision. Marcus was sulking about Jessica's career choice and what he saw as my role in supporting her rebellion against family expectations. And I was exhausted from defending decisions that seemed perfectly reasonable to me, but apparently threatened everyone else's sense of security and control. That night, I sat in my bedroom and began making lists of my contributions to the household over the past 28 years, lists of financial decisions Marcus had made without consulting me, lists of career opportunities I'd passed up to support his ambitions and our family's needs, lists of dreams I'd deferred and goals I'd abandoned. The exercise was both depressing and empowering. Depressing because it quantified exactly how much of my life I dedicated to other people's priorities. Empowering because it demonstrated that I'd been capable of managing complex projects, coordinating multiple stakeholders, and creating successful outcomes for decades. The skills I'd used to run our household and support Marcus's career were the same skills needed to build my own business. Monday morning, I called 3 women I'd known during my original design career, hoping some of them were still working in the industry. 2 of the numbers were disconnected, but the third connected me with Linda Chen, who'd been a freelance photographer when I knew her and now ran a successful marketing agency in Boulder. Linda remembered me immediately and was enthusiastic about the possibility of collaboration. The marketing industry had evolved significantly since I'd left it, but she assured me that good design instincts were timeless and that there was always demand for experienced professionals who understood both creativity and project management. The tools have changed, she said, but the fundamentals are the same. And honestly, Catherine, there's a huge market for consultants who can work with clients over 40. Most agencies are staffed by 20-somethings who have no idea how to communicate with established business owners. We scheduled a lunch meeting for Thursday, and Linda promised to send me information about current design software and industry trends. For the first time in years, I felt excited about a professional opportunity, energized by the possibility of using my skills for something other than family management. Tuesday brought a visit from Sarah, who drove up from Denver to conduct her own intervention regarding my recent behavior. She arrived around noon with the stated intention of having a mother-daughter day, but the obvious agenda of talking me out of the changes I was making. Sarah had always been the most diplomatic of our children, the one who inherited my people-pleasing tendencies and Marcus's strategic thinking. She approached difficult conversations like business negotiations, identifying objectives, and working toward mutually acceptable solutions. "Mom, I'm worried about you," she began as we sat in the living room with coffee and store-bought pastries. She'd brought the pastries as a gesture of goodwill, but also as evidence that she didn't expect me to automatically provide elaborate refreshments for her unannounced visit. "I know everyone thinks I'm having some kind of crisis," I replied, "but I'm actually feeling clearer than I have in years." That's what's concerning. Sudden clarity after years of apparent contentment usually signals something more serious. Have you talked to anyone professional about what you're experiencing? Professional, code for therapist or psychiatrist, someone who could diagnose my desire for change as a symptom of mental illness rather than a rational response to unsatisfying circumstances. "Sarah, what if my contentment wasn't real? What if I was just very good at convincing myself and everyone else that I was happy with a situation that was actually limiting my potential? But you seemed happy. You always seemed like you loved being a mom and managing our home. You were good at it. I was good at it because I dedicated myself to it completely, but being good at something doesn't mean it's the only thing you're capable of doing, or that you should do it forever. Sarah looked genuinely confused. So you're saying you didn't love raising us? That you were pretending all those years? I'm saying I loved raising you, but that wasn't the only thing I loved or could have loved. I made choices to prioritize your needs and your father's career. And now I want to make different choices that prioritize my own development. What about Dad? What about the family? If you go back to work and start focusing on your own career, what happens to everything you've built? Everything I'd built. As if the stable home and strong family relationships were solely my responsibility to maintain, as if other family members were passive beneficiaries rather than active participants who could contribute to preserving what we'd created together. Sarah, your father is 54 years old. He's perfectly capable of taking more responsibility for household management and family coordination. Michael and Jessica are adults who can manage their own relationships and obligations. And you're 26, established in your own career and about to start your own family. None of you need me to manage your lives anymore. But traditions, holidays, family gatherings, you're the one who makes all of that happen. If you're focused on your career, who's going to maintain our family connections? Maybe maintaining family connections shouldn't be one person's job. Maybe if everyone took some responsibility for planning gatherings and coordinating events, our family bonds would actually be stronger, because they'd be based on mutual effort rather than one person's sacrifice. The conversation continued for hours, covering the same ground from multiple angles. Sarah couldn't understand why I wanted to change a situation that seemed successful from the outside. I couldn't make her understand that external success didn't necessarily correlate with personal fulfillment. Eventually, Sarah shifted to practical concerns. What if my business failed? What if I couldn't find clients? What if the financial risk jeopardized our family's security? What if my pursuit of personal fulfillment damaged the relationships I'd worked so hard to build? These were legitimate questions, and I didn't have definitive answers for all of them. But I realized that Sarah was asking me to guarantee outcomes that were impossible to predict, while never questioning whether the current situation was sustainable or satisfying for me long-term. Sarah, I finally said, what would you do if Kevin expected you to give up your career to support his ambitions? What would you say if he suggested you find hobbies instead of pursuing professional goals? That's different. Kevin and I are partners. We both work. We both contribute financially. We both make career decisions together. And that's exactly what I want with your father. Partnership instead of dependence. Mutual support instead of one-sided sacrifice. For the first time in our conversation, Sarah looked thoughtful rather than defensive. But you guys have been married for almost 30 years. Isn't it risky to change everything now? It's riskier to continue living a life that makes me feel invisible and undervalued. Change is scary, but staying trapped in a situation that diminishes you is worse. Sarah left that evening without reaching any conclusions, but I could tell she was beginning to understand my perspective, even if she didn't agree with my choices. She hugged me tightly before she left and promised to support whatever decisions I made, even if she didn't fully understand them. Wednesday morning, I drove to Denver for my consultation with Harriet Morrison. Her office was in a sleek downtown building with mountain views and an atmosphere of professional competence that I found both intimidating and inspiring. Harriet looked exactly as I'd expected, polished and confident, the kind of woman who'd never apologized for taking up space or pursuing her ambitions. "Catherine," she said, rising from her desk to greet me, "you look wonderful. Mountain life. Agrees with you? Thank you for making time to see me. I know this was short notice." "Not at all. I'm always interested in helping women navigate major life transitions. Tell me what's brought you here." I spent the next hour outlining my situation, from the Thanksgiving dinner incident to the family's reaction to my desire for change. Harriet listened without interruption, taking notes and asking clarifying questions about finances, assets, and family dynamics. "Let me make sure I understand," she said when I finished. "You've been married 28 years, raised 3 children, managed the household and family relationships, and supported your husband's career development. Now you want to restart your own career and renegotiate the terms of your marriage. But your family sees this as evidence of mental instability." That's a fair summary. "And your husband's response to your desire for change has been skepticism about your ability to succeed professionally and concern about the impact on your family's current lifestyle." "Right." Harriet leaned back in her chair. "Catherine, I see this pattern frequently. Women who've dedicated decades to supporting other people's ambitions reach a point where they want to pursue their own goals, and their families resist because change threatens the comfortable dynamic they've benefited from. So I'm not crazy for wanting something different at 52? You're not crazy at all. You're experiencing what psychologists call generative concern, the desire to create something meaningful for yourself rather than just maintaining what others have built. It's actually a sign of psychological health, not dysfunction. We spent another hour discussing my options. Harriet explained that I could pursue change within my marriage if Marcus was willing to genuinely support my goals, but that I should also understand my rights and resources if the marriage couldn't accommodate the life I wanted to build. She outlined my financial position, which was more secure than I'd realized. Colorado was a community property state, which meant I had legal claim to half of everything we'd accumulated during the marriage, including Marcus's business equity and retirement accounts. I also had strong alimony potential, given the length of our marriage and my role in supporting his career development. "The key," Harriet explained, "is documenting your contributions and establishing your own financial identity before you make any major decisions. Open your own bank account, apply for credit in your own name, and start building the paper trail that demonstrates your economic value to the marriage." I left the meeting with a thick folder of information and a clear plan for the next steps. Whether I ultimately stayed married or chose divorce, I needed to establish my own financial independence and professional identity. The uncertainty was scary, but it was also exhilarating. Thursday's lunch with Linda Chen exceeded my expectations. Her agency occupied a converted warehouse in Boulder's Arts District with exposed brick walls covered in award plaques and creative campaigns for clients ranging from local nonprofits to national corporations. Linda introduced me to her team, young designers and marketing professionals who were enthusiastic about the possibility of working with someone who'd managed complex family and household systems for decades. "Project management is project management," Linda explained as we toured the workspace. "Whether you're coordinating a family gathering or launching a marketing campaign, you need the same skills. Attention to detail, ability to manage multiple stakeholders, timeline coordination, budget management, quality control. You've been doing all of that for years." She offered me a trial project, designing marketing materials for a client who specialized in luxury home renovation. The irony wasn't lost on me that my first professional assignment in over 20 years would involve promoting the kind of high-end construction work that Marcus's company performed. "The timeline is flexible," Linda said. "Work at your own pace. Use it as a chance to update your technical skills and test whether you want to pursue this direction seriously." I accepted the project immediately, feeling a surge of excitement that I hadn't experienced in years. Driving home through the mountains, I found myself planning how to organize a home office and thinking about design concepts for the renovation company's branding. For the first time in decades, I was anticipating professional challenges rather than family obligations. That evening, I told Marcus about my meeting with Linda and the freelance project I'd accepted. His reaction was predictably mixed, supportive in theory, but skeptical about the practical implications. "That's great, Kat. I'm glad you're exploring this. Just don't let it interfere with your other responsibilities." Other responsibilities? The assumption that my new professional interests would be secondary to my existing family duties, that I would add career demands to my current workload rather than redistributing household obligations to accommodate my changing priorities. Actually, Marcus, I think this is a good time to discuss redistributing some of those responsibilities. If I'm going to build a serious business, I'll need time and mental energy that's currently devoted to managing our household. "What do you mean?" "I mean hiring a housekeeper, as we discussed. I mean you taking responsibility for coordinating visits with your parents instead of expecting me to manage their social calendar. I mean our children handling their own relationship. Maintenance instead of relying on me to remember their birthdays and send appropriate gifts." Marcus frowned. "That seems like a lot of change all at once. Maybe you should establish your business first, see how much time it actually requires. Then we can adjust other things as needed." "No, Marcus, I need the time and space to build something meaningful. Not just squeeze a hobby business into the margins of my existing obligations. This isn't about adding more to my schedule, it's about changing my priorities." The conversation that followed was tense and revealing. Marcus wasn't opposed to me having a career in principle, but he expected it to be subordinate to my family responsibilities. He saw my professional aspirations as a nice addition to my primary role as household manager, rather than a fundamental shift in how I spent my time and energy. I went to bed that night feeling both excited about the opportunities ahead and frustrated by the resistance I was encountering. Change was never easy, but I was beginning to understand that the biggest obstacle to building the life I wanted wasn't external circumstances, but other people's investment in keeping me in the role I'd always played. The next morning, I started work on my first design project in over 20 years, setting up a workspace in the spare bedroom and relearning software that had evolved significantly since my college days. The learning curve was steep, but muscle. Memory kicked in faster than I'd expected. Within hours, I was absorbed in color palettes and typography choices, feeling a creative satisfaction I'd forgotten existed. The renovation company project turned out to be perfect for rebuilding my confidence. Their existing marketing materials were outdated and generic, the kind of bland corporate design that communicated competence but no personality. I spent 3 days developing concepts that emphasized craftsmanship, attention to detail, and the transformation of spaces from ordinary to extraordinary. The parallels to my own life weren't lost on me. When I presented the initial designs to Linda's team via video conference, their response was immediate and enthusiastic. The junior designers peppered me with questions about my creative process, while Linda nodded approvingly at the strategic thinking behind each design choice. "This is exactly what the client needs," Linda said after reviewing the presentation. "You've managed to make luxury construction feel approachable without sacrificing the premium positioning. They're going to love this." The client meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and Linda invited me to participate in the presentation. I accepted immediately, despite not having presented to clients in over 2 decades. The prospect was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Meanwhile, changes were accelerating at home. Michael had responded to his 60-day deadline by actually applying for jobs, a development that surprised everyone, including himself. His first interview was at a local sporting goods store, hardly the career launch Marcus had envisioned for his son, but steady employment nonetheless. The prospect of paying rent and supporting himself seemed to have provided the motivation that years of parental encouragement had failed to inspire. Jessica called twice that week to update us on her cross-country move preparations. She'd found an apartment in San Francisco, arranged for her belongings to be shipped, and given notice at her part-time job in Colorado. Her excitement was infectious, and I found myself living vicariously through her courage to pursue exactly the life she wanted. Marcus remained conflicted about Jessica's decision, but he was beginning to accept it as inevitable. During one of our evening conversations, he admitted that her determination reminded him of his own decision to take over the family business despite having other interests in college. "I wanted to be an architect," he said, a confession that surprised me. "I loved the design aspect of construction, the problem-solving, the creativity. But Dad needed help with the business, and it seemed like the responsible choice. Do you regret it?" "Sometimes, but I built something successful, provided for our family, created jobs for other people. That counts for something. It counts for a lot. But it doesn't mean Jessica has to make the same choice between responsibility and passion. Maybe she can have both." Marcus considered this. "Maybe you can too." It was the first time he'd acknowledged that my career aspirations might be about more than filling empty time or finding new hobbies. The conversation felt like a small breakthrough, a recognition that my desires for professional fulfillment were legitimate rather than symptomatic of some midlife crisis. The client presentation went better than I'd dared hope. The renovation company's owner, David Kellerman, was a man in his 50s who'd built his business through referrals and repeat customers, but recognized the need to expand his marketing reach. He responded immediately to the design concepts, particularly appreciating how they emphasized the personal relationships and attention to detail that set his company apart from larger competitors. "This is exactly what we've been trying to communicate," he said, examining the logo designs on his laptop screen. "We're not just building additions and renovating kitchens. We're helping families create the homes they've always wanted." Linda and I exchanged glances across the conference table. The client had articulated the exact message we'd tried to convey through visual design, proof that the creative strategy was working. David approved the entire project package and asked about ongoing marketing support. Linda suggested a monthly retainer arrangement that would include me as a permanent team member for his account. By the end of the meeting, I had my first steady client and a clear path toward rebuilding my design career. Driving home through the mountains that afternoon, I felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with other people's achievements or needs. I'd identified a problem, developed creative solutions, presented them professionally, and earned both approval and ongoing work. The skills I'd questioned were intact. The creativity I'd wondered about was still flowing, and the professional confidence I'd lost was returning faster than I'd expected. That evening, I shared the news with Marcus over dinner at our kitchen table. His response was genuinely enthusiastic, a marked change from his earlier skepticism about my business prospects. "Kat, that's incredible. I'm really proud of you." "Thank you. It feels good to be using my brain for something other than grocery lists and social calendars." "I've been thinking about what you said, about redistributing household responsibilities. Maybe it's time I took more ownership of family coordination instead of leaving everything to you. The conversation that followed was the most productive we'd had in years. Marcus acknowledged that he'd grown comfortable with me handling all the domestic management while he focused on business development. He agreed that this arrangement had been unfair and unsustainable, particularly if I was going to build my own career. We developed a plan for redistributing responsibilities. Marcus would take over coordination with his parents, handling their social invitations and health appointments instead of expecting me to manage their calendars. We would hire a housekeeper to handle cleaning and basic maintenance, freeing up time I'd been spending on domestic tasks. And we would implement a system for sharing financial decision-making, with both of us required to approve purchases over $1,000. Most importantly, Marcus agreed to support my career development by taking on a larger share of family obligations rather than expecting me to add professional work to my existing domestic workload. The arrangement felt like genuine partnership rather than grudging accommodation. 2 weeks later, Michael announced that he'd been hired at the sporting goods store and had found an apartment to share with a co-worker. His move-out date was scheduled for the end of the month, exactly within the 60-day timeline I'd established. The prospect of independence seemed to have energized him in ways that living in our basement had never accomplished. "I'm actually kind of excited," he admitted during dinner one evening. "I never realized how much I wanted my own space until I started looking for it." "What changed your mind about moving out?" I asked. "I guess I got tired of feeling like a kid. At 24, living with your parents is embarrassing, even if they don't charge rent. I want to feel like an adult, and that means supporting myself." Marcus and I exchanged glances. The tough love approach had worked exactly as I'd hoped, motivating Michael to take responsibility for his life, rather than continuing to enable his dependence. Jessica's departure was more emotional, but equally positive. She drove cross-country with her belongings packed into a rented moving truck, calling from various rest stops to share updates about her journey. Her excitement about starting her new job was infectious, and even Marcus had to admit that her courage was admirable. "She's building the life she wants instead of accepting the one we planned for her," he said, after her final call from San Francisco. "I'm starting to understand why you've been pushing for changes too." The house felt different, with only Marcus and me living in it, quieter but not lonely, more spacious but not empty. For the first time in decades, we had the opportunity to rediscover who we were as a couple, rather than just as parents and household managers. My design business was growing steadily. Word about the renovation company project had spread through Linda's network, leading to inquiries from other clients who needed marketing materials, website design, and brand development. I was averaging 20 hours per week of billable work, enough to feel professionally engaged without overwhelming my schedule. The financial independence was modest but meaningful. Having my own income, even a small one, changed my relationship with money and decision-making. I no longer had to justify personal purchases or ask permission for professional investments. The psychological impact was greater than the economic benefit. 6 months after the Thanksgiving dinner that started everything, I was invited to speak at a women's business networking event in Denver. The topic was career transitions after 40, and Linda had suggested me as someone who'd successfully restarted her professional life after decades of focus on family. Preparing for the presentation forced me to reflect on everything that had changed since that November evening when I'd walked out of my own dinner party. The woman who'd felt invisible and unappreciated had been replaced by someone who felt confident and purposeful. The marriage that had felt like a burden had become a genuine partnership. The family that had taken me for granted was learning to function as independent adults who valued rather than assumed my contributions. Standing before an audience of women facing similar transitions, I shared my story without bitterness or regret. The decision to leave my own Thanksgiving dinner had been a catalyst, but the real transformation had required months of difficult conversations, uncomfortable changes, and persistent effort to build something new. Change is scary, I told the audience, but staying trapped in a life that diminishes you is scarier. The people who love you will adjust to your growth, and the ones who don't probably weren't supporting your best interests anyway. The response was overwhelming. Women approached me afterward with their own stories of feeling invisible in their families, undervalued in their marriages, and uncertain about their ability to rebuild professional identities after years of domestic focus. Many of them had experienced their own versions of my Thanksgiving revelation, moments when they'd realized that their families saw them as service providers rather than individuals with their own needs and aspirations. One woman, a 50-year-old, named Patricia, whose children had recently left for college, described an anniversary dinner where her husband had spent the entire evening discussing business deals while she sat silently across from him. "I realized he didn't see me as a person anymore," she said. "I was just the woman who made his life convenient." Another woman, Joan, had discovered that her adult children only called when they needed something. Child care for grandchildren, help with moving, financial assistance with various projects. "They love me," she said, "but they don't value me. There's a difference." These conversations convinced me that my experience wasn't unique or unusual. Many women my age were struggling with the transition from active parenting to independent adulthood, both for themselves and their children. The role that had defined us for decades was evolving, and we had to choose between clinging to outdated patterns or embracing new possibilities. I started writing about these themes, first in blog posts for Linda's agency website, then in articles for regional magazines focused on women's issues. The response confirmed that there was hungry audience for content about reinvention, career, transition, and family dynamics in midlife. A year after my Thanksgiving revelation, I launched my own consulting practice focused on helping women navigate major life transitions. The business combined design services with strategic planning, helping clients develop both visual identity and practical roadmaps for career changes, business launches, and personal reinvention. The intersection of creative and strategic thinking felt perfect for my skills and interests. I was using everything I'd learned from decades of project management, problem-solving, and relationship navigation, but applying it to help other women build the lives they wanted, rather than just maintaining the roles they'd inherited. Marcus became my biggest supporter, referring potential clients and bragging about my business success to anyone who would listen. Our marriage had evolved into genuine partnership, with both of us contributing financially and domestically according to our strengths and interests, rather than traditional gender roles. "I'm proud of you," he said one evening as we reviewed the financial reports for both our businesses. "But I'm also proud of us. We could have let your changes tear us apart, but instead we used them to build something better." He was right. The relationship we'd built in our 50s was stronger and more satisfying than anything we'd had in our 20s or 30s. We'd moved beyond the parent-child dynamic that had characterized our early marriage to become true partners who supported each other's growth rather than one person's success at the expense of the other's fulfillment. Michael visited regularly from his apartment across town, often bringing his girlfriend Amanda, a teacher who seemed to appreciate his newfound independence and responsibility. He'd been promoted to assistant manager at the sporting goods store and was considering enrolling in business classes at the community college. "I like feeling useful," he said during one visit. "I like solving problems and helping customers find what they need. I never realized work could be satisfying instead of just something you have to do." Jessica thrived in San Francisco, quickly establishing herself as a valuable team member at the environmental consulting firm. Her projects involved renewable energy installations and sustainability assessments for major corporations, exactly the kind of meaningful work she dreamed about during college. She visited Colorado twice a year, but our relationship was stronger now that it was based on choice rather than obligation. "You inspired me," she said during her summer visit. "Watching you rebuild your career at 52 made me realize I didn't have to settle for safe choices just because other people expected it." Sarah remained the most conflicted about the family changes, though she'd gradually come to appreciate the benefits. With less pressure to maintain family harmony and coordinate everyone's relationships, she'd been able to focus on her own career development and relationship with Kevin. They'd gotten engaged in the spring and were planning a wedding that emphasized their preferences rather than family expectations. "I understand now why you needed to change everything," she said, as we discussed wedding plans. "I was so worried about preserving what we'd always done that I couldn't see how limiting it was. For you." The extended family had adjusted to the new dynamics with varying degrees of grace. Helen and Robert initially resisted the idea that Marcus would coordinate their social calendar, but they'd come to appreciate his more direct communication style and his willingness to set boundaries around family obligations. David and Janet seemed relieved that family gatherings were less elaborate and more casual, allowing them to participate without feeling pressure to meet impossible standards of perfection. Thomas remained unchanged, showing up periodically with stories and gifts before disappearing again into his nomadic lifestyle. But his visits felt less disruptive now that I wasn't responsible for managing his impact on household routines and family dynamics. Holiday celebrations had evolved into shared responsibilities rather than one-person productions. Thanksgiving dinner became a potluck affair, with different family members contributing dishes according to their abilities and interests. Christmas gifts were exchanged among immediate family only, with adults handling their own extended family obligations. The events were smaller and simpler, but they felt more genuine because everyone participated by choice rather than obligation. 2 years after walking out of my own Thanksgiving dinner, I received an unexpected invitation. David Kellerman, my first client, asked me to speak at a construction industry conference about effective marketing for family-owned businesses. The audience would be primarily male business owners in their 40s and 50s, many of whom struggled with the same issues that had defined my marriage before our transformation. The presentation focused on the business value of genuine partnership, both in marriage and in client relationships. I shared statistics about women's influence on home renovation decisions and the importance of marketing that spoke to both spouses rather than assuming the man was the primary decision-maker. But I also talked about the personal benefits of supporting your partner's professional growth rather than expecting one person to sacrifice their ambitions for the other's success. The strongest businesses are built by people who feel supported and valued at home, I told the audience. When you invest in your partner's growth, you're also investing in your own success. The response was thoughtful and engaged. Several men approached me afterward to discuss their own marriages and business partnerships, acknowledging that they'd never considered how traditional gender roles might be limiting both their personal relationships and their professional effectiveness. One man, a plumbing contractor named Steve, described his wife's desire to return to nursing after 20 years of staying home with their children. "I keep telling her we don't need the money," he said, "but maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is that she needs to feel valuable for something other than supporting your success," I suggested. Another contractor, Frank, shared his struggle with his adult daughter's decision to major in engineering instead of joining the family business. "I built this company for her," he said, "but she wants to work for someone else." "Maybe the best legacy you can leave "Isn't your business," I replied. "Maybe it's the confidence to build something of her own." These conversations reminded me how common my original situation had been and how transformative change could be when approached with courage and commitment. The men who were most successful in business were often the ones who'd learned to value partnership over control, collaboration over dominance. 3 years after my transformation began, I was invited to write a book about career transition and relationship reinvention in midlife. The publisher had seen my articles and conference presentations and wanted a comprehensive guide for women navigating similar changes. The advance was modest, but the opportunity felt like validation of everything I'd built since leaving my own dinner table. Writing the book required me to interview dozens of women who'd made major life changes after 40. Their stories were remarkably similar to mine, moments of recognition when they realized they'd become invisible in their own lives, resistance from family members who benefited from the status quo, gradual rebuilding of confidence and professional identity, and ultimately transformation of relationships that became stronger when based on mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. The book, titled Serving Yourself, Finding Your Voice, after years of supporting others, was published the following year to positive reviews and strong sales. Book tour events drew audiences of women eager to share their own stories and connect with others facing similar transitions. During a book signing in Denver, a woman named Carol approached me with tears in her eyes. "I read your book after my daughter went away to college," she said. "I'd been feeling so lost, like my whole purpose was gone, but you helped me understand that I could build a new purpose instead of just grieving the old one." Carol had used the strategies in my book to launch a catering business focused on healthy meals for busy families. She'd transformed her empty nest syndrome into entrepreneurial opportunity, using her cooking skills and understanding of family dynamics to build something meaningful for herself. Stories like Carol's confirmed that my experience resonated with thousands of women who'd lost themselves in supporting others. The transformation I'd undergone wasn't unique, but it wasn't automatic either. It required courage, persistence, and willingness to disappoint people who preferred the old version of who I'd been. 5 years after walking out of my own Thanksgiving dinner, Marcus and I hosted a celebration that looked nothing like the elaborate productions I used to create. The guest list included only people whose company we genuinely enjoyed. The menu featured dishes we all loved, rather than complicated recipes designed to impress. The conversation was relaxed and authentic, rather than carefully managed to avoid conflict. Michael brought Amanda and their new baby, a daughter they'd named Catherine in my honor. Jessica flew in from San Francisco with her partner David, an environmental lawyer she'd met through work. Sarah and Kevin came with their 6-month-old son, looking tired but happy as new parents. Even Thomas made an appearance, though he spent most of the evening showing photos from his latest expedition to Antarctica. The gathering felt organic and genuine in ways that my previous holiday productions never had. People laughed freely, conversations flowed naturally, and everyone contributed to both preparation and cleanup without being asked. The focus was on connection rather than perfection, relationship rather than performance. As I looked around the table at my transformed family, I felt gratitude not just for what we'd become, but for the courage I'd found to change what we'd been. The woman who'd felt invisible and unappreciated had been replaced by someone who felt confident and valued. The marriage that had felt like a burden had become a source of strength. The children who'd taken me for granted had learned to function as independent adults who chose our relationship, rather than simply accepting it as obligation. The transformation hadn't been easy or automatic. It had required difficult conversations, uncomfortable changes, and persistent effort to build something new from the foundation of what we'd always been. But the result was a family based on mutual respect rather than traditional roles, individual growth rather than collective stagnation. Late that evening, after everyone had gone home or retired to their rooms, Marcus and I sat together on our back deck looking out at the mountain, views that had drawn us to Colorado decades earlier. The landscape was the same, but everything else had changed. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Walking out that Thanksgiving, forcing all these changes?" I considered the question seriously. The path from that November evening to this moment had been challenging and uncertain. There had been times when the old familiar patterns seemed easier than the difficult work of building something new. But regret? No. "I regret waiting so long to start," I said finally. "I regret all the years I spent feeling invisible and assuming that was just how life had to be, but I don't regret changing it." Marcus nodded. "I regret not seeing what was happening sooner. I got so comfortable with you handling everything that I forgot to notice whether you were happy doing it." We both did what we thought we were supposed to do. The important thing is that we learned to do better. As we sat in comfortable silence, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. The woman who'd served Thanksgiving dinner to 12 people while feeling completely alone had discovered that she didn't have to choose between supporting others and pursuing her own dreams. The key was finding people who valued her enough to support her growth rather than just benefit from her sacrifice. The truth I'd served my family that Thanksgiving wasn't bitter or destructive. It was liberating for all of us. They'd learned to function as independent adults rather than dependent children. Our marriage had evolved into genuine partnership rather than traditional hierarchy. And I'd discovered that reinvention was possible at any age if you had the courage to disappoint people who preferred the limited version of who you'd always been. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.